Hello Year 9, so this is the last lesson in the series of lessons about the civil rights movement. So let's start off by thinking about this statement here. What would you do if someone unexpectedly picked a fight with you? What I want you to do in your exercise book, you're going to write a scale. So you're going to write this question down. What would you do if someone unexpectedly picked a fight with you? And then underneath, you're going to draw this scale. So you're going from number 1, which would mean non-violently, up to 10, which is violently. You're going to mark yourself on the scale, and then you're going to justify where you've placed yourself. So for example, you say, I react violently. Why would you react violently? Because you wouldn't want someone to think you're weak. Could be a potential justification or explanation of your position on that scale. Or if you're going to act non-violently, you might say, I'd mark myself at a 2 because I think there are better ways to solve the problem. So you're justifying where you've placed yourself on that scale. So draw the scale out, mark yourself on the scale, and then write a short paragraph underneath to explain where you've placed yourself on the scale and why you've placed yourself there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is look at 2 statements for Martin Luther King and 2 statements from Malcolm X. So you're going to read the statements. They are available within Teams, and there's a Word document which has these statements on there, or you can just look at the statements now on the next 2 slides. So look at the statements, circle any words you don't understand, underline the main points. So if you download the PowerPoint, you could do it directly onto the PowerPoint, and that's your copy. So you're going to underline the main points. So that's all you're going to do for a minute. We'll come back to the rest of the bullet points, the rest of the task in a second. So here you can see a picture of Malcolm X. If you don't know much about who Malcolm X is, then can I suggest you click on the link. So on the actual PowerPoint, you click on the link. If you run it as a PowerPoint and click on the link, it should take you to the video, which gives you a short explanation about who Malcolm X was and what he believed in. Otherwise, you could copy and paste the link into or onto your computer, and then onto Google, and then find it that way. So you've got 2 statements here from Malcolm X expressing what he believes about violence. If there are any words in it you don't understand, then underline them or circle them. So circle them, you're going to underline the things that are most important in his statement. So if you don't understand something, circle it. If you think it's an important point, underline it. Okay, so I'm not going to read through those because you can read through those yourself. So then equally with Martin Luther King, we all know who he is because we've done quite a lot of work on him. So hence I haven't put a link in for any videos or any explanation, because you know who he is and you kind of know what he believes in now after all the work we've done previously. So read again the 2 statements, circle any words you don't understand, underline what you think is the most important parts that sum up his views on violence. To help you, if you go to the next slide, then this explains some of the words that you might not understand. So the word reciprocal is used by Malcolm X. He talks about you dying being reciprocal. So if something is reciprocal, you're paying it back. You do to others what they do to you. So Malcolm X is arguing that if white people at the time he was living were able to be violent towards black people and kill black people, then why shouldn't black people reciprocate? Why shouldn't they do the same thing back? The next word is potent. Martin Luther King talks about non-violence being a potent weapon. So the word potent means powerful. Sometimes you might have heard it used for example, if someone's got very strong perfume, well, you could talk about that being potent, but it sort of knocks you off your feet with a strong smell. So if something is potent, it's powerful, it's strong, and that's what he thinks non-violence is. Advocate. So this is Malcolm X saying that he doesn't necessarily advocate violence, but in certain situations he does agree with it. In the case of self-defense, and also to show that black people can be equally powerful to white people. So if you advocate something, you support it, you agree with it. He also uses this expression again to try and explain his views that what white people do to black people should be able to do to white people. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So it's saying, I think the gander is a male goose, I believe. So it's saying, you know, if it's okay for white people to behave like that, why shouldn't black people? So it's sort of this strange sounding expression that basically means if one group can do it, then everyone should be able to do it. So you're going to go through those statements either on the Word document or on the PowerPoint, and then after underlining the main points, you're going to write a tweet from Martin Luther King summing up what he thinks about violence. Then you're going to write a tweet from Malcolm X summing up what he thinks about violence. The two sort of fake Twitter pages are again in Teams, so they'll be there and you can download it and then you can write straight onto it. Remember, for Twitter you are only supposed to use 280 characters only, so that's letters, spaces, symbols, hashtags. The reason I'm asking you to do this is it's an exercise really to try and get you to summarize, to squash down the points that Martin Luther King is making and Malcolm X is making. It's one of the hardest skills I think people can acquire. It's one of the hardest, or one of the things that people find most difficult, or pupils find most difficult when they're writing things. Some ways, sometimes they say, oh, I'd rather just copy it all out. Well, how do you sum it up? How do you squish it down? How do you make it sort of say what they mean without using loads and loads of words? How do you get it down to the bare bones, if you like? How do you summarize? So that's what I'm trying to get you to do here. So in the Word document in Teams, there is a copy of the fake Twitter page for Martin Luther King, and there's also one for Malcolm X as well. So you can, as I say, you can either download it and then write straight onto it. You could print it out and write on it by hand, or you could just put your tweet into your book if you can't do either of those things. Okay, so that's the next task. So feel free to stop the PowerPoint now. Stop the explanation video now if you need to, and then go as far as there, and then we'll continue. So after you've done both tweets, and some people I know have done these tweets already, but if you haven't, some of the people who've done them already did it as almost a tweet or a Twitter battle between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So Martin Luther King would make a statement about violence, and then Malcolm X would reply. Then Martin Luther King would reply to that, then Malcolm X would say something. And don't forget, you can use hashtags, so perhaps directly use a quote from them. So you could say hashtag potent weapon, or hashtag good for the goose, good for the gander. So, sort of get into the way that Twitter is written, and use those sort of tools and the sort of things like hashtags to make it seem a bit more interesting. So once you've done both of those tweets, both for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, you're going to then self-assess. So just check it through. Have you stuck to, well, it's 280 now characters. So does it grab attention? Is it interesting? Have you summed up the person's views on the use of violence? And do you understand that person's beliefs? Because if you do, it's going to be much easier to summarize. Okay, after having done that, you're going to move on then to start your discussion text on whether it is ever right to use violence. So the first thing you need to do in your exercise book is to write that title, is it ever right to use violence? And then divide your page in two. So you've got two columns, a yes column and a no column, or an agree and disagree. Okay, so you could set it out, although I'm also going to put on to Teams for you a version of this sheet you can see in front of you now, but it's in PDF form, so you'll have to print it out. So if you'd rather just write it into your book, do that. So on the yes side, is it ever right to use violence? Yes. When is it right to use violence? Why is it right to use violence? Think back to what you wrote on your scale. If you were in favour of using violence, why were you in favour? So perhaps that could develop into an argument. So think about the good reasons for using violence. And then on the opposite side, if it's never right to use violence, then you're going to be putting some of those arguments. Again, you could use some of the arguments of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X to help you with this. Okay, thinking about writing your discussion. Once you've got your arguments in place, you're ready to go, ready to start writing. So think about what makes a great piece of discussion text. How do you need to set it out? What does it need to be? So think about those things. So things like it needs to be balanced. It needs to have paragraphs. It needs to be clearly set out. It needs to use linking statements, things like that. So you could make notes on that in your book before you start. Okay, how do you set it out? Is it ever right to use violence is the title. So the title you can see at the top of this screen, use that in your book. Discussion text, is it ever right to use violence? Start with your introduction. So I've given you a starter there. I also have a writing frame that is also in Teams in your team for your class. So you could use that if you wanted to. Start with your introduction. My discussion text is going to consider whether it's ever right to use violence. So you're introducing what this whole piece of writing is going to be about. Martin Luther King thought that violence was, and then you sum up his view. In contrast, Malcolm X believed that violence was, and then you sum up his view. I am going to consider who is right. So that's your introduction done. Then you're going to move on to the main part of your discussion text, and there's two ways that you could set it out. Example A, you could write all the arguments that agree that it's right to use violence, all those together in paragraphs explaining each argument fully. Then when you've finished that, move on to all the arguments that disagree. So put all those arguments together again, lay them out in paragraphs, explaining each argument fully. So you could do it that way. The second way of doing it, you could write an argument that agrees that it's right to use violence and then counter-argue. So put an argument against that. Okay, so you could say that maybe it's okay to use violence because it's the only thing that some people understand. However, others would argue there are better ways of sorting it out. So you put one argument and then you counter-argued against it. And you do that then going along, so a for argument and then argue against that. Another for argument, argue against that. So you do that all the way along, writing each argument fully until you've covered all your points. So whichever way you've set it out, whether it's example A or example B, once you've done that, you need to then think about your conclusion. Before you do that, I've also added here some examples of phrases you could use. On the one hand, on the other hand, some people might argue, others might say. You could argue that because. So that's where you're going to explain your argument more fully. So make your point, present your evidence, and then explain that evidence to show how it proves your point. You could argue that because, so that's the sort of language you can use to do that. Martin Luther King believed, however, Malcolm X thought. So you're, again, counter-arguing. Some Christians believe that because it says in the Bible that. So there you're producing evidence to back up an argument that a Christian might make. Okay, and you've got arguments on non-violence in your books, so you could use some of those. The one we talked about, like he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, that's an argument to explain that violence just creates more violence. Okay, so finally, when you've written all of that, you then need to conclude or finish off your discussion text. So after discussing all the arguments, I've come to the conclusion that, and then you say whether you are siding with the agree side, that it's okay to use violence sometimes, and then maybe mention, or if you're coming down on the other side, whichever side it is, then add, I made this decision because I was strongly persuaded by the argument that. So you present then the thing that made you come down on one side or the other. What was the strongest argument for you, and why was that so persuasive? Why did it persuade you to agree or disagree? Or, and if you haven't come down on one side or the other, you can say, I'm still undecided because I think the argument that, so then put a strong argument that might persuade you on the one side, agreeing that sometimes you should use violence, is strong, why that was strong for you. But I also think the opposite view of whatever it is also a strong one because. So you're laying out why exactly you're still sitting on the fence and you still haven't made a decision because of the strong arguments on either side. So go for the strongest argument on the agree side and the strongest argument on the disagree to show why you're conflicted and why you still can't decide. And that wraps up the end of your discussion text. Okay, so complete your discussion text, write as much as you can, make sure you explain the arguments fully, showing clearly the reasons for the arguments. Don't just put bullet points, you're writing in paragraphs, you're making a point, you're showing evidence, and you're explaining how that evidence proves your point for every single argument. So that should take, a lot of space up in your book if you're writing it properly. I'm a bit reluctant to give you, length, because as long as you've covered all the arguments, that, it depends the size of your writing and all sorts of things, doesn't it? But you need to make sure you've covered everything. So use punctuation, break up your sentences with commas and full sentences, full stops at the end of those sentences. So make sure that, read over it after you've finished it. If you were to read that out, where would you make your pauses to breathe? Where would you stop? Where would you point things out clearly by breaking it up? Don't forget to start your sentences with capital letters and to use capital letters for the names of things. Divide your discussion text into paragraphs. So it's not one big long piece of writing, it's in clearly set out sections. Okay. Then when you've finished, you can do some reflection on the lesson. I know we did this before, but you can write each of those sentences and finish it off. That should take you, well, for those people who have not done the Twitter exercise, then I would think that this will take you probably 2 lessons at the very least. Okay, good luck with it, and just follow it through carefully